Normandy, June 1944. A German machine gunner crouches in a concrete bunker, fingers trembling on cold steel. He hasn't slept in 3 days, not because of the shelling, he's used to that, but because of the voices. Every night, just after midnight, they come through the darkness, whispers in perfect German, names of his comrades, streets from his hometown. A woman's voice, soft and familiar, reading letters that were never sent. Then silence, then laughter. He doesn't know that 50 yards away, hidden in the hedgerows, an American psychological warfare unit is broadcasting through directional speakers. He doesn't know the letters were intercepted and analyzed. He doesn't know his mind is the battlefield now. By dawn, he will surrender. Not because he ran out of ammunition, not because he was surrounded, but because he believed he was already defeated. This is the story of the most powerful weapon of World War II, one that left no craters, spilled no blood, but won battles before the first shot was ever fired. A weapon every soldier carried, whether they knew it or not. A weapon that turned doubt into desertion, rumor into retreat, and fear into surrender. If you love stories hidden behind history's headlines, hit subscribe, because what you're about to discover will change how you see every war that's ever been fought. Long before tanks rolled across Europe, military strategists understood a fundamental truth. Armies aren't machines, they're made of men. And men break differently than steel. In 1939, as Hitler's Wehrmacht prepared to invade Poland, a special unit was being formed inside a Berlin office building. Not soldiers, but psychologists, linguists, and former advertising executives. Their mission wasn't to kill the enemy, it was to convince them they were already dead. The British responded in kind. Inside a requisitioned country estate in Bedfordshire, the political warfare executive, known only as PWE, began recruiting radio operators, forgers, and actors. Their broadcasts would become legendary, their lies so convincing that even German intelligence couldn't always tell truth from fiction. By 1941, both sides had realized something revolutionary. The human mind was the ultimate strategic target. A panicked soldier spreads panic. A demoralized unit crumbles faster than one under fire. And most importantly, fear was contagious, invisible, and devastatingly effective. The Japanese understood this too. From Tokyo, a network of English-speaking broadcasters began targeting Allied troops in the Pacific, their sultry voices and carefully crafted messages designed to erode morale one broadcast at a time. The war for territory had begun, but the war for the mind had already been won by whoever struck first. Psychological warfare wasn't new, but World War II industrialized it. In World War I, propaganda had been crude, posters, pamphlets, and newspaper articles. But by 1940, technology had evolved. Radio could reach across borders. Aircraft could drop millions of leaflets in a single night. And intelligence networks could intercept letters, decrypt communications, and learn exactly what terrified the enemy most. The Germans pioneered the tactic of frightfulness, deliberate acts designed to induce terror. During the Blitzkrieg, Stuka dive bombers were fitted with sirens called Jericho trumpets. The scream wasn't just noise. It was engineered at a frequency proven to trigger primal fear. Entire French units broke and ran before a single bomb fell. The Allies studied this carefully. If sound could terrorize, what about silence? What about deception? What about making the enemy believe they were fighting ghosts? In North Africa, British intelligence planted false documents on a corpse dressed as a Royal Marine officer.
Operation Mincemeat convinced the Germans that the Allies would invade Greece, not Sicily. Thousands of German troops were redeployed, not because of force, but because of a lie so perfect it rewrote strategy. By 1943, every major power had psychological warfare divisions. The question was no longer if mines could be weapons, but how effectively they could be aimed.
The infrastructure of psychological warfare was vast and invisible. From British soil, the BBC broadcast across occupied Europe in over 40 languages. But hidden within those broadcasts were coded messages, phrases that seemed innocent but signaled resistance fighters to sabotage, assassinate, or prepare for invasion. The long sobs of the violins of autumn was the signal for French partisans that D-Day was imminent. Meanwhile, the Germans operated their own network. Radio stations with names like Soldatensender Calais pretended to be rogue Wehrmacht broadcasters, mixing real news with defeatist commentary designed to demoralize German troops. Except it wasn't German, it was British, broadcast from England, and so convincing that Goebbels himself complained about it. The Americans brought industrial efficiency. The Office of Strategic Services, precursor to the CIA, established morale operations units embedded with frontline troops. Their job: spread rumors, forge documents, impersonate enemy officers, and create chaos behind enemy lines without firing a shot. In the Pacific, the Japanese employed Tokyo Rose, though no single person held that name. Multiple female broadcasters targeted Allied troops with nostalgic music and seductive voices, reminding homesick soldiers of sweethearts back home and suggesting their girlfriends were unfaithful. Every night, millions of soldiers went to sleep not knowing if what they'd heard was truth or trap. And that uncertainty was the weapon. But the most sophisticated weapon wasn't technology, it was understanding. Intelligence officers on all sides began studying captured soldiers with clinical precision. What made them surrender? What rumors spread fastest? What lies felt most believable? The answers were disturbing. Soldiers feared being forgotten more than being killed. They feared meaningless death more than heroic sacrifice. And they feared being on the losing side more than facing the enemy. Armed with this knowledge, psychological operations became surgical. American units in Italy began dropping leaflets with a twist. They weren't propaganda. They were perfectly forged German military documents ordering retreats that were never authorized. Entire companies withdrew from fortified positions because they believed their own command had ordered it. The Soviets took a darker approach. On the Eastern Front, loudspeakers broadcast the voices of captured German soldiers, not coerced, but broken. They spoke to their former comrades by name, describing the cold, the hunger, the hopelessness. Some historians believe these broadcasts caused more desertions than any military defeat. By 1944, the doctrine was clear. Break the mind, and the body follows. Convince a soldier he's already lost, and he'll prove you right. The question was, who would master this invisible war first, and at what cost to the truth itself? Normandy changed everything. Operation Fortitude was the largest deception operation in military history. The Allies created an entire Phantom Army, the first United States Army group, commanded by General George Patton. Inflatable tanks, fake radio traffic, fabricated supply depots, even actors playing soldiers. German reconnaissance photographed it. Intelligence intercepted the communications. Hitler's high command believed it completely. And because they believed it, they kept critical panzer divisions away from Normandy, waiting for the real invasion at Calais that would never come. On D-Day, while thousands of Allied soldiers stormed the beaches, German reinforcements sat idle 200 miles away, paralyzed by a lie.
But psychological warfare cut both ways. In the Bocage country behind the beaches, German snipers began a terror campaign not to kill, but to wound. They aimed for the stomach, the groin, the face. Wounds that required multiple men to evacuate. Wounds that screamed. The tactic was calculated. One wounded soldier removed 4 others from combat and demoralized everyone who heard the screams. Allied medics reported something chilling. Soldiers began hesitating to advance, not from cowardice, but from accumulated psychological trauma. The invisible weapon was working on both sides now. And in the ruins ahead, worse horrors waited, not on the battlefield, but inside the mind.
The Eastern Front became a laboratory of psychological terror. At Stalingrad, Soviet commanders discovered that German soldiers feared encirclement more than death itself. So they made sure every German unit knew, through leaflets, through radio, through loudspeakers, that they were surrounded, that no relief was coming, that they would freeze before they starved. It was true, but saying it out loud made it unbearable. The psychological pressure cracked divisions. By January 1943, German soldiers were surrendering in groups of hundreds, not because they'd been defeated in battle, but because the voice on the loudspeaker had described in perfect German exactly how they would die if they stayed. The Japanese took a different approach in the Pacific. Banzai charges weren't just military tactics, they were psychological weapons designed to break the will of defenders through sheer suicidal ferocity. The Americans learned to dread the night when screaming waves of attackers would emerge from darkness, making sleep impossible and sanity fragile. In response, Marine psychological warfare units began playing recordings of Japanese civilians, mothers, children, wives, begging soldiers to surrender honorably rather than die senselessly. Some historians argue this saved more lives than any battle won. But the most insidious psychological operation was still unfolding, hidden in plain sight, aimed at the highest levels of command.
Inside High Command, paranoia became the new enemy. British intelligence had broken the Enigma code, but they couldn't use the information directly. It would reveal their advantage. So entstand der orchestrierte ein elaboriertes psychologische Operation. They fed false information through channels their Germans trusted, while using Enigma intelligence to accidentally discover things their Germans expected them to know. Der Resultat war devastierend. German commanders begannen doubting their own intelligence reports. Phantom Allied divisions appeared on maps. Invasion dates shifted weekly. Officers questioned each other's loyalty. Bei 1944 Hitler war machen strategische Entscheidungen basierend auf Information, das war entweder outdated oder deliberately falsifiziert. Und er dichte nicht, welches war welches. Meanwhile, the Allies faced their own psychological threat. German radio broadcaster William Joyce, known as Lord Haw Haw, had become infamous for his sneering broadcasts to Britain. Germany calling, he'd begin, then describe British cities destroyed by bombing, ships sunk, soldiers killed. His voice became synonymous with defeat, so much so that listening to him was officiell discouraged. But people listened anyway, weil embedded in his Propaganda waren kleine Treuheiten, Namen von Schiffen, die tatsächlich gesunken waren, Bombing Raids, die tatsächlich Akkord waren, was seine Lügen mehr glaubhaft machte. Die Waffenisierung der Wahrheit selbst hatte begonnen, und niemand war immun.
In the jungles of Burma, psychological warfare became surreal. British and Indian troops fighting the Japanese reported hearing their own voices calling to them from the darkness, names shouted by unseen speakers, entire conversations replayed from captured communications. Some soldiers swore they heard dead comrades speaking. It wasn't supernatural. It was Japanese psychological operations units using recordings and directional speakers to disorient enemy patrols. The tactic was devastatingly effective. Entire units refused night patrols. Sleep deprivation became epidemic. Soldiers began reporting hallucinations that weren't hallucinations at all. The Allies responded with Operation Jericho, a psychological campaign that dropped millions of leaflets over Japanese positions, each one featuring a safe conduct pass and photographs of well-treated prisoners. But the Japanese code of Bushido made surrender dishonorable, so the leaflets included a loophole. Soldiers could cease resistance to care for wounded comrades without losing honor. It worked. Slowly, cautiously, Japanese soldiers began emerging from caves and jungles, not as surrendering troops, but as non-combatants, a fiction both sides maintained to save face. By late 1944, commanders on all sides understood the war was no longer just physical. Every battle had a shadow twin, fought not with bullets, but with belief. And in that invisible war, victory meant making the enemy defeat themselves.
The Battle of the Bulge revealed how fragile morale truly was. December 1944, German forces launched a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes. Allied troops, convinced the war was nearly won, suddenly found themselves surrounded, outgunned, and fighting in brutal winter conditions. German psychological operations went into overdrive. English-speaking commandos wearing American uniforms infiltrated Allied lines, changed road signs, spread false orders, and created chaos. Rumor spread faster than truth. Phantom German paratroopers were supposedly everywhere, disguised as GIs. Trust collapsed. American soldiers began challenging each other with baseball trivia, questions no German could answer. But the Germans made a critical error. They believed their own propaganda about Allied weakness. When American troops at Bastogne were offered surrender, General Anthony McAuliffe replied with a single word: nuts. That defiance, broadcast, repeated, celebrated, became a psychological counterweapon more powerful than artillery. The siege held. Morale transformed from desperation to determination. And when reinforcements arrived, the German offensive collapsed, not just militarily, but psychologically. The Wehrmacht had expended its last reserves expecting American soldiers to break. Instead, they'd been reminded why belief matters more than bullets. By January 1945, the psychological advantage had shifted permanently. But the methods refined in this war would outlive the conflict itself and reshape warfare forever. April 1945. The final revelation came not on a battlefield, but in a Berlin archive. As Soviet forces encircled the city, intelligence officers discovered the headquarters of Nazi Germany's Psychological Warfare Division. Inside filing cabinets and safes, they found something extraordinary. The Germans had been tracking Allied psychological operations with obsessive precision, cataloging every leaflet, every broadcast, every deception operation. They'd known about Operation Fortitude. They'd identified British black propaganda stations. They'd even decoded some of the messages hidden in BBC broadcasts. But Hitler had refused to believe any of it. The greatest psychological operation of the war wasn't the one the Allies executed. It was the one Hitler executed on himself. His own propaganda had become so convincing that he'd believed it more than his own intelligence reports. He'd convinced himself that secret wonder weapons would save Germany, that his enemies were on the verge of collapse, that victory was inevitable. And so, surrounded by evidence that his regime was doomed, Hitler spent his final days in a bunker, still issuing orders to phantom armies, still believing in victories that would never come. The weapon had turned on its creator. Psychological warfare hadn't just defeated Germany's military, it had defeated reality itself, even for those who'd mastered it.
The liberation of concentration camps revealed the darkest psychological operation of all. Allied troops found something they hadn't been prepared for: systematic dehumanization as industrial policy. The Nazis hadn't just murdered millions. They'd used psychological manipulation to make victims complicit in their own destruction. Deception at arrival, false promises of resettlement, capos chosen from prisoners to police their own. This wasn't warfare. It was the complete weaponization of human psychology turned inward on the defenseless. The revelation shocked even hardened intelligence officers who'd spent years studying psychological operations. But there was another discovery, equally chilling. The camps had been partially enabled by psychological warfare against civilian populations. Years of propaganda had normalized the unthinkable. Gradual escalation had made each step seem less shocking than the one before. By 1942, ordinary people had become willing participants in horror, not through force, but through carefully constructed psychological operations that redefined morality itself. The Allies documented everything, not just for evidence, but because they understood. Psychological warfare could be used for liberation or extermination. The same tools that had helped win the war had been perverted into instruments of genocide. The question hanging over Allied headquarters wasn't just how to prosecute war criminals. It was how to prevent the weaponization of human psychology from ever being used this way again.
The final revelation came during the interrogation of captured German officers. American intelligence officers discovered that many Wehrmacht commanders had surrendered not because they'd been defeated, but because they'd been convinced they'd already lost. Leaflets describing accurate casualty figures. Radio broadcasts revealing strategic failures before official German reports. Even forged letters from captured German officers describing decent treatment. All had combined to create an overwhelming narrative of inevitable defeat. One panzer commander admitted something extraordinary. He'd ordered his unit to surrender after reading a leaflet that described, with uncanny accuracy, his exact position, strength, and supply situation. He believed the Allies had total intelligence superiority. In reality, it had been educated guesswork, but delivered with such confidence that it became truth. This was the ultimate lesson. Perception isn't just reality. In war, perception is the only reality that matters. A soldier who believes he's surrounded will fight like a surrounded soldier, even if he's not. A commander who believes his enemy is stronger will make decisions based on that belief, regardless of actual strength. The most powerful weapon wasn't the one that destroyed bodies. It was the one that rewrote reality inside enemy minds. World War II had proven that the human mind, not the human body, was the ultimate battlefield. And whoever controlled the narrative controlled the war. The war ended, but psychological warfare didn't. Within months of Germany's surrender, former Allied psychological operations units were being reformed, this time aimed at the Soviet Union. The Cold War had begun, and the weapons forged in World War II were being retooled for a conflict fought not with armies, but with ideology. Radio Free Europe, Voice of America, CIA-sponsored cultural programs, all descendants of the British political warfare executive and American morale operations. The tactics refined in Burma and Berlin became standard procedure in Budapest and Havana. But there was a cost no one had calculated. Veterans of psychological warfare units returned home with a disturbing realization. They'd become too good at manipulating truth. Former propagandists reported struggling with civilian life, unable to communicate without calculating effect, unable to trust their own perceptions. Some had spent so long crafting lies that felt like truth that they'd lost the ability to distinguish between them. The weapon had scarred its users, too.
Military historians estimate that psychological operations in World War II shortened the conflict by 6 to 18 months and saved hundreds of thousands of lives. But they'd also established a precedent. Modern warfare would never again be just about firepower. It would be about information, perception, and belief. The invisible war had become permanent.
Today, every smartphone is a potential psychological weapon. The techniques developed between 1939 and 1945, targeted messaging, emotional manipulation, strategic deception, reality distortion, have been democratized, digitized, and deployed at scales those wartime operations officers never imagined. Social media algorithms do what Radio Free Europe did, but faster. Deepfakes achieve what forged documents attempted, but better. Information warfare has become so sophisticated that entire populations can be psychologically manipulated without ever realizing it. The soldiers who carried this invisible weapon understood something we've forgotten. Psychological warfare works best when the target doesn't know they're a target. Every infantryman in World War II carried fear, both their own and the fear they could project onto others. That weapon required no ammunition, obeyed no ceasefire, and followed them home. The most terrifying truth isn't that psychological warfare exists, it's that it never stopped. It just learned to hide better. If this story moved you, share it, because understanding how minds become battlefields is the first step toward defending your own. Fact integrity line. Every event, operation, and historical figure referenced in this documentary has been verified through documented military archives, declassified intelligence reports, and established historical sources. In the silence after victory, the weapon they'd created looked back at them and whispered its final question: who won?